The real problem with this new rational religion is that for many colonists it's not very emotionally fulfilling. And in addition to this issue, there is rapid population growth in the colonies in this time period, and it's left them without enough churches and without enough ministers. So, this popular demand for more and for better religion leads to a series of religious revivals. This series spans from the 1730s all the way up through the 1770s, and it has been labeled by historians to be the Great Awakening. Many people looked upon this stirring of spiritual renewal with a great deal of pleasure. It starts in the winter of 1734 to 1735, and in Massachusetts in this time period, a lot of young people who previously would have been out partying and enjoying themselves began to seek religion at the church of a young and very talented minister named Jonathan Edwards, and everyone rejoiced at the sign of this spiritual awakening. But what many of them didn't realize is that this awakening would result in religious conflict, in divided families, in split churches, and in fragmented communities. And in the end, it forever alters the religious landscape of colonial America and in its own way contributes to the American Revolution. In many ways, Jonathan Edwards was the leading intellectual champion of the Great Awakening. He was a New England minister who captured the spirit of the movement when he wrote, quote, "Our people do not so much need to have their heads filled as much as have their hearts touched." And you may in high school have had to read one of his sermons, in particular his fiery sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which was written and delivered in 1741. It offered his parishioners a vision of the eternal fires of hell that awaited them if they refused to convert. And to shake his parishioners out of their complacency and remind them of the necessity of grace for salvation, he compared their own fate to that of a spider dangling above the pit of eternal damnation, with only God's mercy preventing them from falling into the pit. Jonathan Edwards' account of his own Massachusetts revival inspired the English Anglican minister George Whitefield to take his evangelical crusade to the colonies. And when George Whitefield arrived in Philadelphia in 1739, the local ministers, including those of his own Anglican church, welcomed him. He drew audiences in the thousands everywhere he spoke, and in the 15 months of his grand tour, he visited every colony from Maine to Georgia, met all of the important ministers, and was heard at least once by most of the people of Massachusetts and Connecticut. He spoke to the entire community, to rich and poor, slave and free, old, young, male, and female, acting out simple scripts based on biblical stories. The message was always the same: the sinfulness of man and the mercy of God. In a calculated move, perhaps to increase his audiences, Whitefield began speaking out against some of the ministry, accusing them of being unconverted. He started with the deceased Archbishop of Canterbury, John Tillotson, and following his lead, Gilbert Tennent, on a preaching tour of New England, warned about the danger of an unconverted ministry. Tennent implied that some ministers were in it for the money, and that true Christians should leave their churches for those of honest preachers. Even sympathetic ministers were shocked by these accusations, which turned their congregations against them and split their churches. Some leading ministers who already had reservations about the revivalists because of their emotional style now condemned the revival. That only made the revivalist more popular and attracted even larger crowds. The Great Awakening created an attitude that really went against the deferential thinking that had been taught for over 1,000 years in regards to British politics as well as religion. And the people no longer supported the idea of divine right, or the idea that the king was chosen by God and had a mandate to rule over the people. And colonists now saw themselves as much more capable of performing the task of government and even religious leadership than those who had previously done so. And for some, the awakening provided the opportunity to step forward and become lay preachers, and for the first time in American religious history, ordinary people were given a very significant public voice. Now, the picture that you see here is a picture of the Great Chain of Being. which originated in the classical era with Aristotle, but moved forward and was practiced throughout the Middle Ages in Europe. And you see up at the top is God, and just below him would be his angels and sort of the realm of the divine beings. And up at the very top of mankind would be the king, supposedly the one who was chosen to rule over all of the people. And then women actually would be below mankind, and then animals and plants and minerals. And for the first time, this great chain of being was being questioned, and the chain of authority was no longer thought to run from God to the ruler to the people, but instead it was believed that it ran from God to the people to the ruler, and that the people were the ones who gave the ruler their power. So this radicalism is really echoed when colonists turned against the tyrannical ways of King George III of England. The Patriots didn't turn to a church at this point. They turned to what they believed was the supreme judge of the world, their God. And they were finally able to step out from under the protectorate of established Christian churches and to assert religious control over their nation's own destiny, apart from these sort of ideologies about absolutism and divine right. In a few cases, women touched by the Spirit began preaching, an action that prompted their own ministers to denounce them for flouting the accepted roles assigned to women in colonial society. And testifying to one's religious experience was one thing that might have been accepted, but assuming the role of a preacher, a role traditionally reserved for men, was simply too radical, as we've seen before with the character of Anne Hutchinson. Some of these women during the Great Awakening even started creating new religions that challenged gender ideals. So two of these ladies are Jemima Wilkinson, who was very strongly influenced by the Quakers and claimed that she died of typhus in 1776 and had been resurrected as the public universal friend and was brought back to the world, to those on earth, to see and talk to them about the imminent arrival of God's second coming. And she only had 260 followers, but still she represents this shift during the Great Awakening in which some women are beginning to undermine the patriarchal structure. And another one of these women you may have heard of before is Mother Ann Lee. She's the founder of the Shakers, and she was an illiterate preacher who couldn't read, who promoted a religion that believed that sex was the root of evil, and that focused on singing and dancing instead of formal sermons. And we're going to talk about the Shakers at length when we talk about 19th century utopian societies. But again, she's representative of this larger trend of attempting to overthrow these gender hierarchies, whether these women realized they were doing it or not. One other aspect of the Great Awakening that helped lead to the American Revolution is the development of the idea of a government being ruled by a contract, and the idea that state rule is a contract that can be abolished when it's no longer in the interest of the people. And it becomes based off of not just the Enlightenment theories of Locke and also Rousseau, but on the belief during this time period that churches entered into contracts with their believers, and that believers owed the church their obedience, and that in return the church owed congregants the duty of being faithful to the gospel. So those who led the church would stick to the words of the Bible and preach biblical testimonies. So this gave parishioners the right to dissolve their covenant and to sever ties with the church without any kind of prior permission. And this is later illustrated in the social contract or social compact theory that's in the Declaration of Independence. And you can see the Declaration of Independence here. And if you go down to the second paragraph, it's really spelled out. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." So in essence, this declaration is adopting this new idea that if the government is no longer in the best interest of the people, that this government is ruling from the consent of the governed, and that it can be altered or abolished. The Great Awakening certainly changed American society. The evangelical methods employed by gifted preachers implicitly challenged the hierarchical assumptions of colonial society about gender, about race, and about social status. Individuals exercised greater choice, many choosing to leave their own congregations and find one that better suited their spiritual needs. But not all ministers approved of this new revival. The opponents of this revivalism were called the Old Lights, and they often favored sermons that were based on learned explications of biblical texts. Rather than reading specifically from the Bible, they themselves began to interpret in front of the congregation and allowed their own congregation to read the text and interpret it themselves. So some books and sermons of the Old Light ministers were actually burned, and congregations were divided between the two groups, which caused many communities to begin pulling apart. Today, many people argue about the intentions of the founders of America in writing the Constitution, and one of probably the most popular things that people discuss is the idea of the separation of church and state. But what historians have realized over time is that many people don't understand why there's a separation of church and state in America. They don't understand the history behind it. And the roots of it can really be traced back to this Great Awakening. The Great Awakening created religious pluralism within the colonies. And this just means that the colonists didn't have to adhere to one single denomination. It wasn't like in England at one point where you had to practice Protestantism or you might be killed, or you had to practice Catholicism or you might be executed. And so people became much more tolerant of other churches that shared their basic faith. If you think back, for example, to the colony of Maryland, they had this act of toleration where all Christians were welcome, whether they were Catholic or Protestant. The only people who weren't welcome were those who didn't believe in God and didn't believe that Christ was the Son of God. So at this point, you're not going to see any more Anne Hutchinsons or Roger Williams. And in fact, they're going to discourage others from seeking to impose their denominations on other people. People began to be attracted to lots of different types of denominations and not just official state churches, and it popularizes this idea of the freedom of religion as well as separation from church and state. Even those who don't like the Great Awakening can leave the established churches and then they can go and join the Unitarian or the deist congregations, so they also have options available to them. And this separation of church and state is what prevents uniformity of religion from becoming a reality or ever fully taking over our government. So in essence, all that is happening here is that with all of these new religious denominations, they just want to make sure that they're all on equal ground, that they're all on even footing, and no one religion becomes more important than the other in the founding of our nation.